The cabin smelled like blood and pine, and something Brielle could not name, something animal and ancient that clung to the back of her throat like smoke. She was knuckle-deep in the wound of a dying wolf when the door exploded inward. Wood splintered against stone. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of rain and violence. Brielle kept her eyes down. Her hands were pressed against matted fur and a gash so deep she could feel the ribs beneath, and the wolf beneath her fingers was fading fast, its heartbeat stuttering against her palm like a moth trapped under glass. "Do not stop," she whispered to herself. "Do not stop. Do not stop. Do not stop." The wolf whimpered. Its massive body shuddered, and a fresh wave of warmth spread between her fingers where the wound pulsed. Behind her, boots hit the floor. Heavy, deliberate. The kind of footsteps that belonged to someone who had never once in his life needed to announce himself because every living thing already knew he was coming. "What is this?" The voice was low. Quiet in the way a blade is quiet before it cuts. Brielle's stomach dropped through the floor. She knew that voice. Every wolf in the Northern Territories knew that voice. Alpha King Soren Haldrick, ruler of the 5 provinces, warlord of the Ashfall campaign, the man whose name alone had ended sieges. The man who was currently standing 3 feet behind her in the illegal wolf sanctuary she had been running out of an abandoned trapper's cabin for the last 2 years. She was going to die. That thought arrived with perfect clarity, settled into her bones like cold water, and she accepted it in the same breath because the wolf under her hands was still alive, and she was not going to let it go. "I said," the king repeated, and she felt him move closer, felt the heat of him at her back, felt the sheer physical pressure of his presence like a hand pressing down on her spine. "What is this?" "A wolf with a collapsed lung," Brielle said without turning around. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, given that her hands were shaking. "If you are going to arrest me, I respectfully ask that you wait 4 minutes." Silence, the kind that pressed against the walls. She heard him exhale, a single controlled breath, and then nothing. He stood behind her and watched as she worked, as she packed the wound with a moss and resin compound she had developed herself, as she murmured to the wolf in the old tongue that her grandmother had taught her before the fevers took her. The wolf's breathing steadied. Its heartbeat found a rhythm. Brielle closed her eyes and let out a long, shaking breath. "It will live," she said, pulling her hands free and wiping them on her already ruined apron. She turned around and froze. Alpha King Soren Haldrick was enormous. She had known that in the abstract way everyone knew it, the way you know mountains are tall and oceans are deep. But knowing it and standing close enough to see the scar running from his left temple to his jaw were 2 very different experiences. His eyes were the color of deep amber, almost gold, and they were locked onto her with an intensity that made every nerve in her body catch fire. But he was not looking at her. He was looking past her, at the wolf on the table, at the 6 others bandaged and sleeping in makeshift beds of straw and old blankets, at the shelves lined with tinctures and salves and jars of dried herbs, at the careful, meticulous, undeniable evidence of years of illegal healing. His jaw tightened. A muscle jumped beneath the scar. "How long?" he asked. Brielle swallowed. 2 years. "How many wolves?" "I stopped counting after 200. Something shifted in his expression. She could not read it. It might have been fury. It might have been awe. It might have been something else been awe. It might have been something else entirely. Something that had no name in any language she knew. But before he could speak, one of the wolves stirred. Not just any wolf. The largest one, a scarred gray male with a torn ear and a wound across his ribs that Brielle had spent 3 days stitching shut, lifted his massive head from the straw bed in the corner. He looked at the king. He looked at Brielle. And then, with the slow, deliberate calm of a creature that feared absolutely nothing, he stood, crossed the room, and lay down at Brielle's feet. The king stared. The wolf closed his eyes and pressed his muzzle against her ankle. Brielle held her breath. Because that wolf, the one now resting against her like she was the safest place in the world, bore the royal brand on his flank. He was one of the king's own, and he had chosen her. 3 hours earlier, the morning had started with a snake bite. Brielle Ashwick had been sorting dried calendula in the back room of Fenmore's only apothecary when Pella, the tanner's youngest, burst through the door clutching her forearm and wailing loud enough to wake the dead. "Viper!" Pella gasped. "In the woodpile!" Brielle dropped the calendula, grabbed her kit, and went to work. Tourniquet first, then the poultice, a dense green paste of charcoal, plantain leaf, and crushed elderflower that she had perfected over years of trial and error. She talked the whole time, the way she always did when someone was scared, low and steady, her voice a thread for them to hold on to while their body fought the poison. "You are going to be fine," she told Pella. "The swelling will peak in about an hour and then start going down. You will feel sick to your stomach. But that is the antidote working, not the venom. And you will have a spectacular bruise to show off at the market." Pella sniffled. "Will it scar?" "Barely. I will give you something for that too." By the time Pella's mother arrived in a breathless panic, the girl was sitting upright, sipping warm broth, with her arm neatly wrapped and the color returning to her face. "Brielle Ashwick, you are a gift from the gods," the mother said, pressing coins into Brielle's hands. Brielle tried to refuse. She always tried to refuse. The apothecary charged what it had to in order to keep the shelves stocked and the roof from leaking, but anything beyond that felt wrong. Healing was not a transaction. Her grandmother had drilled that into her before she could walk. You do not trade mercy for copper. But the woman was already gone, dragging Pella home with firm instructions to rest, and Brielle was left standing in the empty shop holding 3 copper pieces she did not feel she deserved. That was the shape of her life in Fenmore. She worked the apothecary during the day, treating burns and fevers and the occasional snakebite, and she kept her head down. Fenmore was a border village, small and forgettable, the kind of place people passed through on their way to somewhere that mattered. Brielle had lived here for 5 years, long enough to be trusted, not long enough to be known. Not really. Nobody in Fenmore knew about the cabin. It sat 2 miles north of the village, deep in the Thornwild, a stretch of dense forest that most people avoided because the trails were unreliable and the wolves were thick. Brielle had found it during her first winter, half collapsed and abandoned, and she had rebuilt it with her own hands, beam by beam, stone by stone, until it was solid enough to hold what she needed it to hold. The wolves had started coming to her on their own. That was the part no one would have believed. She had not gone looking for them. She was not a shifter. She carried no pack affiliation, no bloodline claim, nothing that should have drawn a wild wolf within 100 yards of a human woman living alone. But they came, limping out of the Thornwild with torn flanks and infected wounds and broken bones that had healed wrong. They came to her door and waited, patient and silent, until she opened it. The first time, she had been terrified. A massive black wolf with a gash across its shoulder had appeared on her doorstep at dawn, and she had stood frozen in the doorway for a full minute before her healer's instinct overrode her fear. She treated the wound, fed the wolf strips of dried venison, and watched it disappear back into the trees by nightfall. It came back 3 days later with another wolf. This one had a broken foreleg. After that, they never stopped coming. Brielle could not explain it. She was not a wolf whisperer, or a mystic, or a blessed child of the old gods. She was a woman who knew herbs, who had steady hands and a stubborn refusal to let anything die if she could prevent it. But the wolves trusted her. They let her touch them, clean their wounds, set their bones. They slept in her cabin and ate from her hands and pressed their warm bodies against her legs while she worked. It was illegal. Profoundly, catastrophically illegal. The sovereign edict of the 5 provinces classified unauthorized contact with territorial wolves as a crime against the crown. The penalty ranged from imprisonment to execution. The law existed because wolves in the Northern Territories were not just animals. Many were bonded to packs, some carried shifter bloodlines, and a rare few were direct extensions of the Alpha King's own line. Touching one without permission was considered an act of trespass against the king himself. Brielle knew all of this. She had known it the first time she wrapped a bandage around a wolf's torn paw. She did it anyway. That afternoon, she closed the apothecary early, packed her satchel with fresh supplies, and took the North Trail into the Thornwild. The path was narrow and overgrown, barely visible unless you knew where to look, and Brielle moved through it with the ease of long practice. She reached the cabin as the light was turning gold through the canopy. 3 wolves were waiting. 2 she recognized, a mated pair she had been treating for weeks. The female had a wound on her hind leg that refused to close, and the male never left her side. The third was new, young and lean, with a deep laceration across his ribs that looked fresh. "Oh, sweetheart," Brielle murmured, kneeling beside him. "What happened to you?" She worked through the evening, cleaning and stitching and applying her salves, moving between the wolves with quiet efficiency. The cabin was warm, the fire crackling, the air thick with dried lavender and pine resin. She did not hear the riders approaching through the Thornwild. She did not see the royal banners through the trees. She did not know that Alpha King Soren Haldrick, who had been tracking a missing wolf from his personal guard for 11 days, had just followed its trail directly to her door. The first warning she got was the sound of the door exploding inward. In the aftermath of the king's arrival, Brielle expected chains. She expected guards to drag her out of the cabin and throw her into a cart bound for the provincial prison. She expected the wolves to scatter, the way any sane animal would when confronted with the most dangerous predator in the realm. None of that happened. The king stood in her cabin surrounded by sleeping wolves, and his gaze fixed on the gray male pressed against Brielle's ankle, the one wearing his royal brand. His expression cycled through shock, disbelief, and beneath it all, buried so deep she almost missed it, a raw and aching relief. "Kethra," he said. The name came out rough, scraped from somewhere deep. The gray wolf lifted his head at the sound and looked at the king. Then he yawned, settled his chin back onto Brielle's foot, and closed his eyes. Brielle watched the king's expression. She watched the way his throat worked, the way his hands, massive and scarred and capable of unspeakable violence, hung loose at his sides like he had forgotten what they were for. "That wolf," Brielle said carefully, "has been here for 9 days. He came to me with infected lacerations across his ribs and a fever that nearly killed him. The wounds were not from another animal." The king's gaze snapped to her. "What are you saying?" "I am saying someone cut him with a blade, deliberately." The temperature in the room dropped. His eyes changed. The amber darkened, and for a moment she saw the wolf behind the man, vast and furious and barely contained. "Who?" One word, quiet as a grave. "I do not know, but the cuts were precise, surgical, almost. This was not a brawl or a territorial dispute. Someone wanted him to suffer." He turned away, shoulders rigid, jaw locked so tight she could see the tendons in his neck standing out like cords. He walked to Kethra and crouched slowly, moving with a care that seemed almost painful for a man his size. He extended one hand, palm up. Kethra opened one eye, regarded the king's hand, closed his eye, and pressed himself more firmly against Brielle's leg. Something broke across the king's face, there and gone in less than a second, but Brielle saw it. A flash of hurt so raw it made her breath catch. "He will not come to me," the king said flatly. Brielle knelt and placed her hand on Kethra's flank. The wolf's breathing was steady, his body warm and relaxed. He is still healing, she said. Wolves who have been hurt by people take time to trust again, even people they loved before. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since entering the cabin. Not at the wolves, not at the shelves of illegal remedies. At her. You speak about wolves as though you understand them, he said. I do not understand them, Brielle replied, but I listen. Then Corbin, the king's commander, appeared in the doorway. Brielle had not even noticed the other men outside, but now she could see them through the shattered door frame. Soldiers on horseback, armed, their faces hard and suspicious, at least a dozen. Sire, Corbin said, his tone clipped, the woman is in violation of the sovereign edict. She should be detained and brought before the provincial magistrate. The king kept his gaze on Brielle. What is your name? Brielle Ashwick. And what are you? A healer? A witch? An apothecary, Brielle said. I run the shop in Fenmore. I treat people too, not just wolves. Sire, Corbin pressed, the edict is clear. I am aware of what the edict says, the king replied without turning around. I wrote it. Brielle's blood went cold. He stood, every motion carrying a predator's economy. She healed one of my wolves, one that my own trackers could not find for 11 days. One that someone in my own ranks may have tried to kill. He paused. And you want me to arrest her? Corbin's mouth opened, then closed. She stays, and she comes with us to Ashenmere. Brielle's stomach plummeted. Ashenmere? She repeated. The royal seat, the king's stronghold, the center of power for the entire northern realm. Why? He looked down at Kithra, still stubbornly refusing to acknowledge his own master. Because that wolf trusts you more than he trusts me, he said. And I need to know why. He walked out without waiting for a response. Brielle stood alone in the warm, herb-scented cabin and tried to make sense of what had just happened. She was not being arrested. She was being taken to the royal stronghold because a wolf had fallen asleep at her feet. Outside, one of the soldiers brought a horse for her, a steady chestnut mare with kind eyes and a calm temperament that suggested someone had chosen the animal deliberately. Brielle climbed on with shaking hands and tried not to think about what she was leaving behind. The cabin, the wolves still healing inside it, the life she had built so carefully in Fenmore, small and quiet, and hers. About an hour into the ride, Corbin fell beside her, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. You should know, the king has not slept in 4 months. Brielle turned to stare at him. What? 4 months. Since the ashfall. He closes his eyes and he wakes within minutes. Every time. The commander's jaw tightened. He is dying, Miss Ashwick. Slowly. But he is dying. Why are you telling me this? Corbin looked ahead at the king's rigid back, and Brielle saw something in the commander's face she recognized because she wore it herself every day in the cabin. The desperate, exhausting devotion of someone trying to save a life that refused to be saved. That wolf, Corbin said, nodding toward the cart behind them where Kethra lay wrapped in blankets, sedated for travel. He has not let anyone touch him since the ashfall. Not the king, not the healers, not the handlers. He attacked 3 men who tried, but he let you. The commander fell silent. The horses moved on. Brielle stared at the back of the king's head and felt something cold settle in her stomach. She was not being brought to Ashenmere as a prisoner or as a healer. She was being brought as an experiment, and she had no idea what would happen if the experiment failed. Ashenmere was carved into the side of a mountain. The stronghold rose from rock like it had grown there, massive dark stone walls broken by narrow windows catching the last light of the dying sun. Towers climbed toward the clouds. The gates were iron and ancient, wide enough for 10 riders abreast, and the sound they made when they opened echoed through Brielle's ribs like a second heartbeat. Inside, the keep was overwhelming. Corridors branched in every direction, lit by torches that cast long, restless shadows across stone floors worn smooth by centuries of boots. Servants moved with the quiet efficiency of people who knew exactly where they belonged. Brielle knew neither where she belonged, nor what was expected of her. A woman named Thessaly, thin and sharp-featured with silver streaked through her dark hair, met them in the main hall. She was the king's head healer, and her expression when she looked at Brielle could have curdled milk. "This is the apothecary?" Thessaly asked Corben, her tone suggesting she had been expecting something rather more impressive. "This is Miss Ashwick," Corben confirmed. Thessaly circled Brielle slowly, studying her the way one might study a questionable piece of meat at market. "You have no formal training." "I apprenticed under my grandmother," Brielle said. "She was a root healer in the eastern valleys." "A root healer?" The words dripped with exactly as much respect as Brielle had expected, which was none. "You will be given quarters in the East Wing. You are not to leave the keep without escort, and you are not to touch any of the king's wolves without direct supervision." "Understood," Brielle said, even though every instruction felt like a cage closing around her. Corben walked her to her room in silence. It was small, but clean, with a narrow bed, a writing desk, and a window that looked out over the valley below. "The king will send for you tomorrow," Corben said from the doorway. "Rest." "Commander," Brielle said before he could leave, "Kethra, where will he be kept?" "In the royal wolf quarters, with the others." Brielle shook her head. "He will not settle there. Not yet. The stress of the journey, the new environment, being surrounded by wolves he has not seen in months. His wounds are still healing. If he panics in a room full of unfamiliar wolves, it could set his recovery back weeks." "You want him with you," Corben said. "I want him somewhere he feels safe." The commander studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once and left. 20 minutes later, 2 guards carried Kethra's sleeping body into her room on a stretcher and set him down beside her bed. Brielle knelt beside him and checked his wounds. The stitches were holding. The infection had not returned. She adjusted his blankets, smoothed the fur along his neck, and settled onto the floor beside him with her back against the bed. "We are in the king's house," she told him quietly. "I do not know what they want from us, but I am not going anywhere." Kethra's ear twitched in his sleep. Brielle closed her eyes. She woke to the sound of claws on stone. The room was dark. The fire burned down to embers, and Kethra was on his feet. He stood rigid in the center of the room, ears flat, hackles raised, a low growl vibrating through his body. He was staring at the door. Brielle's pulse spiked. She stood slowly, placing herself between the wolf and whatever was on the other side. "Easy," she whispered. "Easy." The door opened. The king stood in the corridor, alone, without guards or ceremony, just a loose shirt, dark trousers, and the hollow, bruised expression of a man who had not slept in so long that his body was starting to betray him. He looked at the growling wolf. He looked at Brielle. Something in his expression shifted. A crack in the stone mask, and she saw it again. That flash of hurt, brief and devastating. "He used to sleep at the foot of my bed," the king said quietly. "Every night." Brielle did not know what to say to that. The grief in his voice was so plain, so unguarded, that it felt like witnessing something she was not meant to see. "What happened to him?" she asked softly. "The truth. Not what your trackers reported. Not the official version." He leaned against the door frame. The motion was almost imperceptible, the kind of lean that a man running on nothing allows himself when he thinks no one is watching. But Brielle noticed. She noticed the shifting weight, the hand bracing against wood, the slight tremor in his fingers, the eyes losing focus for half a second before he forced them sharp again. 4 months without sleep. She had seen what 2 nights of fever did to a grown man. She could not imagine what 4 months did to a king. "There was a fire," he said. During the Ashfall campaign. An ambush. My wolves were with me. He paused, and the silence was heavy. 12 wolves went into that valley. 4 came back. Kethra was not one of them. But he survived, Brielle said. He survived, the king confirmed. But when we found him weeks later, he attacked anyone who came near. Not me, not his handlers, no one. And then he disappeared. Brielle looked down at Kethra, rigid and watchful, eyes fixed on the king. She could feel the tension in the wolf's body, the war between recognition and fear. He remembers you, Brielle said. He fears me, the king corrected. Those are not the same thing. He looked at her, and for a moment the mask slipped completely. Exhaustion, grief, guilt, all laid bare in amber eyes that had no defenses left. Can you help him? He asked, and the way he asked it, quiet and raw and stripped of every scrap of authority, told Brielle that he was not just asking about the wolf. Yes, she said, but it will take time and trust. He needs to choose you again on his own terms. He nodded slowly, straightened with visible effort, and turned to leave. Your Majesty, Brielle called after him. He paused, but did not turn around. When was the last time you slept? His shoulders tightened. He did not answer. The door closed behind him, and Brielle stood in the dark room listening to his footsteps fade down the corridor. Beside her, Kethra whimpered once, softly, and pressed against her leg. Brielle knelt down and wrapped her arms around the wolf's neck. He was trembling. I know, she whispered. I know. She held him until the trembling stopped. She held him long after that, and somewhere in the back of her mind, a thought she did not want to name was already forming, sharp and unavoidable. The wolf was not the only one in this castle who needed saving, and she was not sure she was equipped to save either of them. Within 3 days of her arrival, Corbin brought Brielle to the royal wolf quarters, a sprawling stone complex attached to the eastern wall of the keep, where the king's bonded wolves lived and trained. The main chambers were impressive: heated stone floors, ventilated rooms, a full staff of handlers and veterinary healers who had trained for years under the crown's best. And every single one of them was struggling. The wolves that had survived the ashfall were broken. Not physically, those wounds had healed months ago, but something deeper had been damaged. They paced their enclosures endlessly. They refused food for days at a time. They snarled at their handlers and cowered from loud noises and woke in the night howling at nothing. 3 had become so aggressive they had been moved to a separate isolation wing, muzzled and chained. Brielle stood at the entrance to the isolation wing and felt her stomach turn. Unchain them, she said. The chief handler, a stocky man named Devorin with forearms like tree roots, looked at her like she had suggested setting fire to the keep. Those wolves will take your arm off. They are terrified, Brielle said. Chaining a terrified animal makes it more dangerous, not less. Devorin opened his mouth to argue, but Corbin cleared his throat. The king has authorized Miss Ashwick full access to the wolf quarters. She has his permission to try whatever she sees fit. Brielle entered the first isolation chamber alone. The wolf inside was enormous, a dark brown male with a muzzle scarred from the chains and eyes burning with directionless fury. He lunged the moment the gate opened, hitting the end of his chain with a force that rattled the iron ring in the wall. Brielle sat down on the cold stone floor, 6 feet away. She opened her satchel and took out a jar of salve she had been making since her first year in the Thornwild. Pine resin, lavender oil, chamomile, and something else. Something she had never been able to name but that her grandmother had called the Quiet, a compound that smelled like safety. She opened the jar and set it between them. Then she waited. 20 minutes. The snarling faded to a low growl. 45 minutes. He lay down, body still coiled but no longer lunging. An hour. His nose twitched at the scent from the open jar, and the rigid tension in his shoulders eased by a fraction. 90 minutes. His eyes closed. When she finally stepped out, Devorin was waiting with an expression she could not read. "How?" he asked. "Patience," Brielle said. "And the right smell." "I have been handling wolves for 20 years. That animal nearly killed Trevette when he tried to change the water bowl." Trevette approached him standing up, wearing leather armor, carrying a chain. Everything about that interaction told the wolf he was a threat. Brielle wiped her hands on her apron. "I sat on the floor and offered him something that smelled like a forest. That is not skill. That is common sense." Davorin stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "Common sense," he repeated. "Right." She worked through the isolation wing one wolf at a time over the following days. Some took hours. One, a young female with burns across her back, took 2 full days before she would allow Brielle within arm's reach. But they all came eventually, and as they healed, the keep shifted around her. The handlers stopped watching with suspicion and started watching with curiosity. Davorin brought her supplies without being asked, and once, when she ran out of pine resin, he sent a runner to the forest to collect more before she could ask. Even Thessaly's hostility softened into clipped professional questions. "What concentration of lavender oil? Where did you source the pine resin? Our suppliers carry a different grade." Brielle answered everything. She held nothing back. If these people could learn her methods, could carry them forward after she was gone, then every wolf in the realm would benefit. That mattered more than any credit or recognition. Through it all, the king watched. She caught him sometimes, a shadow in a doorway, a figure on the balcony overlooking the wolf yard, a presence she felt before she saw. He never entered the quarters while she worked. He never interrupted. He simply observed, and each time she caught his gaze, she saw a man watching someone do the thing he could not. One evening, she returned to her room to find a new pillow on her bed. Thick and soft, wrapped in clean linen. No note, no explanation. The next morning, a heavy wool cloak draped over her chair. Dark green, lined with fur, finer than anything she had ever owned. Again, no note. "Thank you for the pillow," she told the king when she saw him in the corridor 2 days later. "And the cloak." He frowned. "I do not know what you are referring to." "Of course not. My mistake." His ears reddened. He walked away faster than usual. That night, lying awake, she thought about the man behind the stone mask. The man who left gifts he would not claim. Who watched her heal his wolves from a distance because he believed they no longer wanted him close. Who had not slept in 4 months and carried the weight of that loss in every rigid line of his body. The warmth behind her ribs was no longer faint. It was a steady, constant ache that grew worse when he was near, and unbearable when he was not. "This is going to be a problem," she whispered to Kethra, curled on the floor beside her bed. The wolf huffed in agreement. Brielle had been sitting with 3 recovering wolves, reading aloud from a field guide on northern wildflowers because the sound of her voice seemed to calm them, when the door opened and the king walked in. She stopped mid-sentence. The wolves lifted their heads. Soren stood just inside the threshold, his body rigid with the effort of appearing relaxed. No crown, no weapons, but his presence filled the room the way sunlight fills a window, overwhelming and impossible to ignore. "Corbin suggested I observe," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Of course," Brielle managed, her pulse climbing. "Please, sit wherever you are comfortable." He chose a stone bench along the far wall, as far from the wolves as the room allowed. He sat with his forearms on his knees, his head slightly bowed, making himself smaller. Brielle recognized the instinct. He was trying not to be a threat. She resumed reading. 10 minutes passed. The burned female stopped trembling. 20 minutes. The wolf in the corner lay down. 30 minutes. A large male named Havik, the most responsive to Brielle's treatment, crossed the room. Not toward Brielle, toward the king. Brielle held her breath. Havik stopped 3 feet from Soren and stood perfectly still, amber eyes locked on the king. Soren extended no hand, spoke no word, just sat there, head bowed, breathing slowly. The wolf took another step, then another. He pressed his nose against the king's knee. Soren's hand shook. He lifted it, trembling in a way Brielle had never seen from a man so physically powerful, and placed it on the wolf's head. Havik closed his eyes and leaned into the touch. A sound escaped the king's throat. Low and involuntary, the sound of something cracking open after being locked shut too long. Brielle looked away. The moment felt too private. She stared at the page in her lap and blinked hard against the burning in her eyes. When she looked up, his eyes were closed. His breathing had changed, deepening, slowing. The deliberate rhythm of a man fighting sleep and losing ground. His head dipped forward, caught himself. Dipped again. His chin dropped to his chest. His hand went slack against the wolf's head. He was out. Brielle counted the minutes. 5, 10, 15, 23. The longest he had slept in 4 months. Corbin appeared in the doorway. He took one look at the scene, the sleeping king. The wolf pressed against his knee, the other animals arranged around the room like sentinels, and froze. Then he mouthed 2 words across the room. "Do not move." She did not move. 28 minutes. 31. The king stirred. His eyes opened, unfocused and confused. And for a moment he looked so young and so lost that Brielle's throat tightened painfully. His hand was still resting on the wolf's head, and when he realized that, something raw and unguarded moved across his expression. Then he saw where he was, saw Brielle watching him, saw Corbin in the doorway. The mask slammed back into place so fast it was like watching a door close. He stood and left the room without a word, his stride long and deliberate, as though he could outpace the vulnerability of having been seen. Corbin waited until the footsteps faded. 31 minutes, he said quietly. Was it the wolf that calmed him? Brielle thought about the way Havik had crossed the room, the way the wolf had chosen to approach, the way the king's entire body had unclenched the moment he felt the warm weight against his knee. "I think it was being trusted," she said. He came back the next day, and the next. Each time the wolves moved closer. Each time he slept longer. 40 minutes. 52. An hour and 17 minutes. He never acknowledged it. When he woke, he left immediately, his stride quick, as though he could outpace the vulnerability of having been seen. But the gifts continued. A leather-bound journal, a jar of wildflower honey from the southern provinces. Boots, perfectly sized, made of soft brown leather lined with wool. "I notice you have new boots," Thessaly observed one morning during their increasingly cordial exchanges over herb inventories. "They appeared," Brielle said, mysteriously. "The king," Thessaly said dryly, "is about as subtle as a landslide." One evening, Brielle was adjusting Kithra's bandages when a knock came at her door. Soft, hesitant. The king stood in the corridor looking uncertain, almost nervous. "I owe you an explanation," he said. He sat in her chair, too large for it by half, his knees nearly touching the bed frame. Brielle sat on the bed. The room felt very small with him in it, and very warm, and she was acutely aware of every breath he took. "The wolves are not the only ones the ashfall damaged," he said, his voice low. He stared at the floor between his boots. "The things I saw in that valley, the decisions I made, the orders I gave." He paused. "They follow me into sleep, every night, without exception." Brielle let him talk. He told her about the ambush, the fire that had been set deliberately to trap his wolves. the decision to press forward because retreating meant losing the eastern province entirely. The men and wolves he had lost, the sounds they had made. She listened without interrupting. She let him put his grief into words, and she held every single one. When he finished, the fire had burned to embers. "Thank you for listening," he said. At the door, without turning, he said, "The boots are from the cobbler in the lower town. If they do not fit, tell Corbin and he will have them adjusted." Brielle smiled. "I thought you did not know what I was referring to." His ears went red. He left quickly. Alone, she pressed her hands against the ache behind her ribs. She could feel him moving away down the corridor, could feel the distance between them like a weight settling on her bones. Kethra climbed onto the bed, which he was absolutely not supposed to do, and laid his enormous head in her lap. "I am in so much trouble," Brielle whispered. The wolf sighed in a way that suggested he agreed completely. It happened without warning. 3 weeks into her stay at Ashenmere, Brielle was sitting cross-legged on the floor of the wolf quarters with Kethra's head in her lap and 2 others dozing around her. The king was on his bench, asleep for nearly 2 hours, his longest stretch yet. Even Corbin, who usually stood guard at the door with rigid discipline, had allowed himself to lean against the wall and close his eyes. The room was warm. The wolves were peaceful. The only sound was the layered rhythm of breathing, animal and human, steady as music. And then Soren screamed. Not a shout, not a gasp. A scream, raw and torn from somewhere primal, a sound that should not have come from a human throat. His body jackknifed off the bench. His eyes were open but seeing nothing, pupils blown wide and fixed on something that existed only behind them. The wolves erupted. Kethra launched to his feet, snarling. The 2 sleeping wolves scrambled backward, crashing into equipment. Corbin was through the door in an instant, blade drawn. Brielle crossed the room in 3 strides and grabbed the king's face between her hands. His skin was ice cold. His body shook so violently she could feel it in her teeth. "Soren," she said. His name, not his title. She had never used it before. "Soren, come back." His eyes found hers but could not see her. Behind them, she glimpsed a reflection of something burning, something vast and terrible and alive. "Come back to me," she whispered, pressing her forehead against his. His hand shot up and gripped her wrist. The pressure was crushing, the strength of a man who could break bone without effort, and Brielle gasped but held steady. The shaking slowed. His grip loosened. Awareness flooded back into his eyes like water filling a vessel. He blinked. He saw her. "Brielle," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like the first breath after drowning. He released her wrist, looked down at the red marks his fingers had left on her skin, and horror washed across his expression. "You did not hurt me," Brielle said before he could speak. "I could have. But you did not." He pulled away, standing so abruptly the bench scraped against stone. He looked at Corbin, at the drawn blade, at the wolves still agitated and pacing. His jaw clenched. "Clear the room," he ordered. "Now." The look in his eyes, the shame, the self-loathing, the absolute conviction that he was dangerous, told Brielle that pushing now would only drive him further behind his walls. She left. Back in her room, she pressed her fingers against the fading marks on her wrist. They would be gone by morning. But the image of his expression when he saw them would stay longer than any bruise. Kethra paced the room, agitated, mirroring the restlessness inside her own body. The tug beneath her sternum had become something desperate, demanding she go back, find him, refuse to leave him alone with whatever was eating him alive. She did not go back. Not that night. She did not sleep either. In the morning, Corbin found her in the corridor outside the wolf quarters. His face was drawn, his usual composure cracked at the edges. "He has locked his chambers," the commander said. "He will not open the door. Not for me. Not for Thessaly. Not for anyone." He is punishing himself, Brielle said. He believes he is protecting everyone else. Those are the same thing. 2 days passed. The king did not emerge. Brielle threw herself into work with focused, mechanical precision, but her hands shook, and her concentration fractured at the edges. She dropped a jar of salve and stood staring at the broken glass for a long time before she could make herself move. "You look awful," Thessaly said bluntly on the second afternoon. "Thank you." "I mean it. Sit down before you fall down." Brielle sat. Thessaly studied her with the sharp, clinical eye of a woman who had spent 30 years reading bodies. "How long have you been feeling this?" the healer asked. "The ache. The inability to function when he is not nearby." Brielle's face burned. "I do not know what you are talking about." "Child, I have served 3 kings and watched 2 mating bonds form before my eyes. I know exactly what I am looking at." Thessaly leaned forward. "And so do you. A mating bond that goes uncompleted will consume both parties," Thessaly continued. "You know this." "I am not a shifter," Brielle whispered. "I cannot bond with him. It is not possible." Thessaly took Brielle's hand. The gesture was so unexpected that Brielle nearly flinched. "Why do you think the wolves come to you?" the healer asked. "Because I help them. Wolves do not seek help from humans. Not wild wolves, not territorial wolves, not bonded wolves. In 30 years, I have never seen a wolf voluntarily approach an unaffiliated human for healing, unless that human carries something the wolf recognizes." "Recognizes as what?" "Pack." The word settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water. "Your grandmother," Thessaly continued. "The root healer. What was her bloodline?" "She never said. She raised me after my parents died. She taught me everything about herbs and healing, but she never talked about where she came from." "I think she came from wolves," Thessaly said. "And I think whatever gift she carried, she passed it to you." The idea was staggering, and yet it fit, like a key sliding into a lock she had not known existed. The wolves. The warmth she felt when she healed them. The connection that went deeper than medicine. "It does not matter what I am," Brielle said finally, "if he will not open his door." Thessaly squeezed her hand. "Then you knock louder." That evening, Brielle stood outside the king's chambers. The corridor was empty. The torches cast long shadows across the stone. She could feel him through the door, feel the connection between them like a hook behind her sternum, sharp and insistent. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again. "Go away." His voice was muffled, wrecked. "No," Brielle said. "Soren, open the door." "That is not a request you get to make. And locking yourself in your room is not a strategy, it is a tantrum." She heard movement, the lock turning. The door opened. He looked terrible. Gray-skinned, hollow-eyed, the bones of his face standing out in sharp relief. 2 days of nothing layered on 4 months of almost nothing, and Brielle could see the toll written across his body like a sentence. "You need to leave," he said. "I need to stay," she corrected. "And so do you. In the same room, preferably within arm's reach." His jaw clenched. "I grabbed you hard enough to leave marks. And I have had worse from a spooked horse. You were in a nightmare. You did not know where you were." "That is the problem." His voice dropped. "If I cannot tell the difference between the nightmare and you." He stopped. "I would sooner lose my crown than hurt you." The words hit her like a closed fist. Not because they were dramatic, but because she knew, with bone-deep certainty, that he meant every syllable, without reservation. "Then let me help you," Brielle said. "So it does not come to that. You cannot fix this." "Maybe not. But I can be there when it drags you under, and I can pull you back." His fingers pressed into the door frame until the knuckles went white. "On 8 one night," he said, "and you sleep on the far side of the room." She stepped inside, and the ache behind her ribs eased for the first time in 2 days. But as she settled into the chair he had placed as far from his bed as the room allowed, as she watched him lie down with the rigid tension of a man who trusted nothing, not even his own body, she felt something else stir beneath the connection between them. A presence. Not hers. Not his. Something deeper. Something old. Something that had been sleeping inside her for her entire life, and was now, slowly, unmistakably, waking up. Brielle sat in the chair and watched the king fight his own body for hours. He lay rigid, jaw locked, fists clenched against the sheets, and she saw the exact moment exhaustion won because his entire frame surrendered at once, like a building collapsing inward. He slept for 40 minutes. Then a low, broken sound escaped his throat. Full-body tremors made the bed frame shudder. His fingers clawed at the sheets. Brielle crossed the room, sat on the edge of the bed, and took his hand. The trembling stopped. His fingers closed around hers, desperate and unconscious, and within seconds his breathing evened out. The nightmare released him. He sank deeper into sleep, and Brielle sat beside him in the dark, holding his hand, feeling the warmth beneath her ribs settle into something steady and golden. She stayed until dawn. When the first gray light crept through the window, she carefully extracted her hand and moved back to the chair. His eyes opened the moment she let go. "How long?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. 5 hours. He stared at her. 5 unbroken hours, the first time since the ashfall. "You were supposed to stay in the chair," he said. "You were having a nightmare. And you came closer. Toward the man who grabbed you hard enough to bruise. Toward the man who needed someone to hold his hand. There is a difference." He sat up slowly. The movement brought him close enough that she could see the dawn light catching the scar along his jaw. Close enough to smell his scent. Pine and iron and something deep and warm that made her pulse quicken. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "The truth." Brielle thought about lying, thought about saying it was duty, or compassion, or a healer's oath. All true. None of them the truth. "Because I feel you," she said. "All the time, like a thread tied beneath my ribs. When you are close, it is warm. When you are far, it hurts. When you are in pain, I cannot breathe." He went very still. "I know it should not be possible," she continued, her voice shaking. "But Thessaly thinks my grandmother carried wolf blood, and whatever she was, she passed it to me. The wolves recognized something in me. And you." She faltered. "You feel it too. I know you do." "Yes," he said. One word, barely audible. "Then stop sending me away." "You should be afraid of me." "Well, I am not. And neither are your wolves. Not anymore." She leaned forward. "Kethra let you touch him yesterday. Did you know that? I set your hand on his flank while you were sleeping, and he pressed into your palm." Something shattered behind his eyes. The last wall crumbled, and what was behind it was not the controlled king or the stone-faced warlord. It was a man so tired and so lonely and so terrified of breaking the things he loved that he had locked himself away from all of them. "I cannot stop it," he said, and his voice broke on the last word. "The fire, the valley. Every time I close my eyes, I am there. I can smell the smoke. I can hear them dying. My wolves. My men. And I gave the order. I gave the order to press forward, and they followed me. And they burned." Brielle sat beside him and took his hand. "You gave the order to save an entire province," she said, "and it cost you everything. That is not a crime. That is leadership. It feels like murder. I know. But you are carrying the weight of every life you could not save, and you are using it to punish yourself. The nightmares are not just memories. They are a sentence you keep passing on yourself every night." He was shaking. She could feel it through their joined hands. You are allowed to put this down, she said. You are allowed to grieve and still choose to live. Those men and wolves who followed you did not follow you so you could die slowly in a locked room. They followed you because you were worth following. Honor them by surviving. He leaned forward until his forehead rested against her shoulder. Brielle wrapped her arms around him and held on. He cried. Silently, his body shaking against hers, his hands gripping the back of her shirt. She held him through it, her cheek pressed against his hair, her eyes burning, and she let him break open because he had been holding himself together for so long that the breaking was the only way back. Long enough for the dawn to turn golden. Long enough for his breathing to steady and his body to grow heavy against hers with the unmistakable weight of sleep. He had fallen asleep against her shoulder. No pretense, no experiment. Just a man who had finally let himself trust someone enough to close his eyes. She eased him back onto the bed. His face in sleep was younger, softer, the hard lines smoothed away. She brushed the hair from his forehead and felt the warmth behind her ribs blaze so bright it nearly undid her, and beneath it, the deeper presence stirred again. The thing that had been waking inside her. She felt it now, not with fear, but with recognition. It was hers. It had always been hers. A wolf, quiet and patient and ancient, curled in the deepest part of her spirit, waiting for the moment she was ready. She closed her eyes and reached for it. It reached back. The bond did not snap into place the way the stories described. It bloomed, slowly, warmly, like the first day of spring breaking through frozen ground. She felt it unfurl between them, connecting her to him at a level beyond language, beyond thought. She felt his heartbeat synchronize with hers, felt his breathing match her own, felt for the first time in her life, completely and utterly whole. Soren's eyes opened. He looked at her, and she watched him feel it, the bond, her, everything. Brielle, he said, and her name sounded different now. It sounded like home. She kissed him. She leaned down and pressed her mouth to his, and he responded with a gentleness that made her eyes burn. His hand came up to cradle the back of her head, his fingers threading through her hair, and the kiss deepened slowly, tenderly, like they had all the time in the world and intended to use every second of it. When they pulled apart, his eyes were wet. I do not deserve this, he whispered. You do, she said. You do, and I am going to spend every day proving it to you until you believe me. He pulled her down beside him, wrapped his arms around her, and held her against his chest. They slept. No nightmares. No fire. No screaming. Just warmth and breath, and the steady golden hum of a bond that had been waiting their entire lives to find them. The healing was not a single moment. It was 1,000 small ones. Soren still woke in the dark sometimes, his breathing sharp, his body rigid with echoes of smoke and screaming. But Brielle was there, every time. Her hand found his, and his breathing would steady, and he would press his face against her hair and whisper things he would never say in daylight. She whispered them back. The wolves healed alongside their king. One by one, the survivors of the ashfall returned to their handlers, calmer, steadier, carrying the scars but no longer ruled by them. Kethra was the last. He had spent months pressed against Brielle's side, and the morning he crossed the room and laid his head on Soren's knee without hesitation, the king's eyes filled with tears he made no effort to hide. Ashenmere adjusted. Not easily and not without resistance. A village apothecary with no name and no bloodline bonded to the Alpha King. The court found it unthinkable. The council found it inconvenient. Thessaly found it entirely predictable. I knew the moment he started leaving gifts, the healer told Brielle dryly. The man could conquer a province but could not simply tell a woman he was fond of her. Brielle laughed. She did that more often now. Months later, on a morning so quiet it felt sacred, Brielle woke to pale light and the sound of steady breathing. Soren was asleep beside her, one arm draped across her waist, his face peaceful and unguarded. Kethra lay at the foot of the bed, his great gray head resting on his paws. No nightmares, no locked doors, no fire behind closed eyes. Brielle placed her hand over the bond mark on her collarbone, felt the warmth pulse gently beneath her skin, and smiled. She settled back against her mate, closed her eyes, and let the morning hold them. They slept,